Good afternoon, and welcome you all to the second session of National Seminar on Interdisciplinary Research Approaches. Half a century ago, philosopher of science Karl Popper famously observed, "We are not students of some subject matter, but students of problems. And problems may cut right across the boundaries of any subject matter or discipline." This statement has become increasingly relevant. Today, many of the phenomena and problems that we are trying to understand and solve indeed cut across the traditional boundaries of academic disciplines. Modern technological developments and globalization add to the intricacy of problems, and in response, we are becoming increasingly aware that an integrated approach is necessary. Now, we'll have a session on topic interdisciplinarity in research, which will be handled by Dr. Priya Nair, and the same will be chaired by Dr. C.S. Biju, Dean of International Affairs and Associate Professor from the Department of English. So I invite the chairman for this session, Dr. C.S. Biju. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Tujo. May I welcome you again, all participants, and especially our respected resource person, Dr. Priya Nair, to this auspicious gathering of the National Webinar on Interdisciplinary Studies. There are quite a few important discussions recently. Not recently, in the last decades of the 21st century, in connection with the evolution of a disciplinary turn in humanities, arts, and social sciences. This disciplinary turn was actually a move towards critical thinking in teaching and learning, and obviously towards critical interdisciplinarity in humanistic inquiry. This turn, again, is a reaction to two problems: the transformation of universities and other academic institutions in the late 20th century, and the reshaping and the challenges evolved due to the reshaping of methodologies. And disciplinarity was established as a precise context of modern academia with the evolution of German academic institutions and Wissenschaft, scientificization. In proper English, this is something like disciplinization of knowledge. As a practitioner of interdisciplinary research, I have often identified the limitations of interdisciplinarity and the possibilities of incorporating approaches, methodologies, and resources from many disciplines. See, for example, the kind of blurring of the genres which took place in humanities and social sciences, philosophy, and the arts in late 20th century is one of the major reasons why the interdisciplinary turn took place. As we know, in visual arts, visual and performing arts, postmodernism definitely provided the backdrop, provided the ground for the blurring of the genres. But this is actually a phrase coined by Clifford Geertz while he was studying studying anthropology with the Balinese cockfight. He defined the idea of blurring of the genre as one of the most important features of contemporary academic disciplines. And today we have a very eminent, resourceful academician as our resource person, and who's serving as the research officer of the Kerala State Higher Education Council, Dr. Priya Nair. Formerly, she was teaching at the Department of English, St. Teresa's College. And she had experiences in Ras Al Khaimah University as a professor, and as an academic, intellectual, and a renowned translator from Malayalam to English. I basically noticed two aspects of Dr. Priya K. Nair's career, most important features of Dr. Priya Nair's career. They are, she is a renowned translator. Her translations are appreciated widely, worldwide, especially her translations of T.D. Ramakrishnan, eminent Malayalam novelist T.D. Ramakrishna's Francis Itikora, which a novel, when it was published in Malayalam, that invoked a new sensibility, a new sort of a radical literature, and there is essentially an induction of historical, scholastic, theological, all foundations into the framework of a novel. The second novel, again by T.D. Ramakrishnan, Sugandhi Andal Devanayaki. I'm so proud that I'm one of the readers of the script of the translation. And an early novel by T.D. Ramakrishnan, Alpha, also was translated by Priya Nair. The first two novels were published by Harper in London, and the third novel was published by Macmillan. And the latest work is also very interesting. It is a translation of Umar Nathan, a renowned forensic surgeon whose memoirs with the title Dead Men Tell Tales, which was also published by Harper. And Dr. Priya Nair is one of the eminent personalities in translation who transformed the process of translation as almost like a creative process, a process of academic inquiry and scholastic deliberations. So nowadays, it's obvious that many people consider translation as a very prospective profession in Malayalam. And secondly, Dr. Priya Nair is an eminent academic researcher who is practicing interdisciplinary research in Kerala. And she is well known as an exceptional scholar of unexplored terrains of research. And her interest in anthropology, psychology, linguistics, critical theory, sociology, and what else, all she tries to bring to her research process with her students and otherwise. This is a great privilege to have such a resourceful intellectual, academic and intellectual as a resource person for today's session. I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Priya K. Nair, and I'm thankful to Ms. Sindhu for her warm introduction. Over to you, ma'am. Yeah, please, ma'am.
Shall I start? Shall I start?
Yeah, sure,
Okay.
please.
So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the Department of English, St. Thomas College, Dr. Biju, to Dr. C.S. Biju, who introduced me, to Dr. Biju, who called me. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. So, well, I'm going to speak about interdisciplinary approach or interdisciplinarity in the process of research. And this might seem very new to us, but actually, the idea of research or the idea of thought, the idea of knowledge was not as bifurcated as it is now. When human beings first started thinking, they did not think of, the rocks in one place, water in the other, and the air in the next. They thought of everything together. It was much later that a differentiation set in. And right now, I'm sure that most of the research scholars sitting and listening to me, when I talk to them of interdisciplinary research, they would be in their minds asking, well, you can sit there and talk about all these things because you have done your research, you're clear. What do we do with the bureaucracy? What do we do when the bureaucracy tells us that, no, you are a student of MA English, you are not allowed to do research in anything other than English? So let the bureaucracy be on one side. Let us not think about it at this moment of time. But let me assure you that the way forward in literature or any sort of research is the first step is to break down the disciplinary boundaries what is known as the disciplinary silos that we ourselves have erected in our minds. And in the process, we have erected a cross disciplinary thought, and we have created boundaries. And it is precisely because these boundaries exist that we are not able to think holistically. Let me begin by giving you an example. When Pliny, when Aryabhatta, when they started thinking about the world, they were, like I said, they were nomadic intellectuals. They did not focus in one area. They did not remain rooted in one area. Rather, they allowed their minds to travel. The problem was that in Europe, after a certain point of time, with Bacon and all started writing, Roger Bacon started writing, there was a problem they found. They said that anything which is not empirical, anything which cannot be tested and found to be true, anything which is not based on rationality is not science. So when we think about feminist scholars in science, the first thing that they would tell you is that the the idea of seeing nature as not something which is outside you, but something in which you are definitely imbricated in. That separation is a masculine separation. It's a patriarchal separation. And that is why science sort of pushed out anything that was not masculine or sort of not objective, not rational. And they thought that all that is feminine in approach. The problem begins when you divorce ethics from science. And this was very glaringly, very cruelly experienced, I would say, when the Nazis drew on the finest minds in England, in Europe, to launch their program of genocide. So there was the scientists were not thinking about ethics, about morality, because that was not rational. That was not what do I say, logical. That was very subjective. Now the question is, when we have such amazing minds around, why were these scientists not able to prophesy or foresee rather the fact that the earth would be in such a difficult situation as it is right now, with climate change, with global warming, with untimely floods, with seasonal floods, and a variation of climate change across the world? Why were not they able to foresee it? One of the reasons which is given is that the indigenous population or women, because of their role of nurturing, they were used to seeing nature as part of themselves, or rather, they were used to admitting that they're dependent on nature. It is this masculinist perspective, which is very hierarchical, which is very hegemonic, that persuaded us to think of nature as something to be conquered, something which is the other. And we are actually experiencing the difficulties, the negative impact of such an insular sort of thinking. So I hope I have made my point clear. It is when you divorce a certain perspective from a particular discipline, it's when you say that, "Oh, this is not what we want," it is then that a holistic approach is missed, and we tend to look at something from a very, very insular point of view. And that is why it is said that in the contemporary world, or rather previously, research was knowing more about less and less. To know more and more about less and less is the work of research. So that is the idea that we are going to disrupt now. We're going to talk about threshold concepts, which hinder you from thinking in a very insular manner. They disrupt this categorization. They disrupt the hegemony, and they force you to think in an inclusive manner. The exclusivity of thought, the insularity of thought is what is being questioned. So, like I said earlier, what we need are organic thinkers. What we need are intellectual nomads, like Syed, for example, who was able to let his mind wander from the idea of politics to literature to race to science. Nothing is left unconnected. You have to just what the organic intellectual or what the nomadic intellectual, as they are sometimes called, they join the dots together. We focus on the dots. I hope you get the difference. As a researcher who is very rooted in his or her own discipline, what we see are the dots, and we see the dots in, under the microscope very clearly, the multiple dimensions of the dot we see. But we are unable to make it relevant to us. We're unable to connect these dots and understand why this is important for us. I think the problem is there when we teach our students history. Because when we teach the students history, they just given a lot of dates, a lot of events, but they're not told the cultural paradigm that this event created, the perspective difference that this event created. And that is why history, which is such a vibrant subject, remains a dry subject. And why people, when they talk about history, automatically imagine that all history is just learning by heart certain dates and certain wars and certain names. That is the problem. Those are the dots. What we miss because of this lack of nomadic thinking is the ability to join these dots together to get different pictures at different times. And that is also very important, because we no longer are asking you to find the same answer always. The answer is contextual. Like you have people like Sandra Harding who talk about standpoint epistemology. The answer need not be the same always. The context will change the solution, and the solution will alter the context also. So let us open our minds to these possibilities when we start talking about interdisciplinarity in research. So first I'll talk about the modes of interdisciplinary research. How do you bring in the idea of the multiple into the singular, and how do you disrupt the idea of the singular? Then in the next part, I'll just introduce a couple. Some of you may have read these books. They're very interesting books. Then they have extensively, or rather they have only made use of the interdisciplinary approach. You cannot actually approach it from any other angle. So yeah, let's move on. Like I said, let's begin with the idea of the intellectual nomad. So being a nomad is about moving your mind from one place to another, never getting rooted. It's about being an intellectual magpie, so a bird who sort of gathers a lot of things from different places, and not just reading widely, but having the intellectual ability to understand the context and the diverse interests. So, being an intellectual nomad, like I quote, is about planting a variety of seeds in the inner garden of your mind. So, um, interdisciplinary um, talk is about integrating knowledge and methods from different disciplines using a synthesis of approaches. So it's not a standalone approach, you use multiplicity of approaches. Now, again, let me tell you, I mean, this talk is not existing on an esoteric level where I sort of think about a utopia where, research will be multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, far from that. What I'm trying to tell you is that no matter what you are doing, no matter what area you're doing research in, it is your duty as a responsible researcher to understand the context in which a particular production has taken place. For me, I'll just begin with an anecdote. For me, I realized the importance of interdisciplinarity when I started practicing translation. It is only then that you understand that it is not the mere linguistic jugglery or language jugglery where you replace a word of one language into another. That is not what happens in translation. You need to get the cultural context of the source text and the target text, number one. And if you want your novel, if it's a novel, you want it to be read by people. So you have to know the pulse of the audience. What are they interested in? And what are the words that they would find archaic? What are the words they would find relevant? So it is a cultural study as well. It is a study of etymology, it's a study of culture, it's a study of business, because publication, which author are the publishers likely to grab? Which author or which type of novel is the publisher going to want? So you need to know business. So you cannot sort of think of translation as sitting in a corner and having a thesaurus by your side and a dictionary by your side and very, very isolated to sit and do it. No, that is not what happens. And you need to watch a lot of English movies as well. Because for me, I'm just an English teacher. My idiom may be frozen. I need to know what the current idiom is, because otherwise my meaning will not be conveyed to my target audience. This especially so in the case of people in India, because we are probably the only people who translate from our mother tongue into English. Everywhere else, the opposite thing happens. They translate from another language into English, which happens to be their first language. So, like I said, everything, even the very process of translation, which is just supposed to be a linguistic exercise, needs an interdisciplinary approach in order to make it a fruitful exercise. So, interdisciplinary, like I said, integrates knowledge from different disciplines. So, yeah. Interdisciplinary studies involves a combination of multiple academic disciplines into one research project. You can draw from sociology, anthropology, psychology, economics, etc. It's about creating thinking across boundaries. The problem here is that The moment we talk about interdisciplinarity to our students and you say, give them all these names, immediately what do? They say, we'll do a psychological interpretation of literature, and they choose Freud. That is the tragedy of the syllabus, because they don't know that Freud has been challenged multiple times. Neo-Freudians have again been challenged. Feminists have challenged Freud. So without knowing all these things, they still grow up on the age-old, the dream, the dynamics that Freud has brought into literature. So this is another danger that we must guard against, because we need to know what is currently happening in the area of psychiatry, in order to allow our students to launch into a psychological study of some text. So unless and until we know, and again, psychiatry is very contextual. We do not. We have to again think about the context of the text, the context in which the research is being done. All these different contexts have to be analyzed from a psychiatrist's perspective. And for that, we definitely need an insight into the medical knowledge which is being circulated at the present moment of time, and also at the moment when this particular text was being written. You have Foucault, who problematized the idea of the sane and the insane. So what I'm trying to tell you is that it is not enough to read just your primary material and the so-called secondary material with which you're going to analyze your primary material. That is not even research. That is just analysis. So this, for me, I'm very embarrassed by my PhD thesis. I just don't want my scholars to be embarrassed by their PhD thesis, because look, don't do dated stuff. Don't do things which have already been said. And when somebody comes to me and says, oh, "Ma'am, I can't find any secondary material," I say, "Good. No, that means you're going to do something original." And that's another advice. If the n number of materials are available about a particular book, leave that book, because you have nothing new to contribute, and you're not doing a literary survey. You're going to produce an original thought about a particular genre or a particular text. Okay. Yeah, we're talking about interdisciplinarity. Now, when we talk about literature as an interdisciplinary subject, it means that literature is sharing a space where diverse views come together and sit alongside one another. And that is where Elizabeth Zeng, she's a teacher in a university abroad, and she says literature is a malleable subject and it demands methodological promiscuity. You don't need to be very faithful to one particular methodology. You need to open your eyes wide to the n number of ideas that are in circulation at any given point of time. Right. Yeah. And Osborne, I quote from Osborne. So, like Osborne said, a sociologist who's collaborating with a geographer is not as interesting as an artist working with a scientist. So, you have a branch of learning or knowledge called Neuro Art History. And Neuro Art History actually talks about your nervous system and the impact that the art has on the nervous system, and how certain type of artists focus on lines and certain other school of art is on color, and the vibrations that may have happened in their brain, and the reasons why they chose to work in one slot instead of the other. So you have this uh, highly interdisciplinary approach in the field of art as well. Now, due to a highly rigidly compartmentalized higher education framework, disciplines tend to be more willing to judge uh, their own disciplines rather than engage in a collaborative process as an interdisciplinary dialogue. As a consequence, in many universities and academic institutions, it appears that only lip service is being paid to the idea of interdisciplinary approach, and they remain cradles of structured disciplinarity. So this is very, the answer to this, why does this happen, is very simple, because each methodology, sorry, each discipline has very clearly created boundaries. And you say, oh, this is physics, will not come within chemistry, or this will not come within mathematics, and they have their own tools of analysis. They have their modes, they have their perspectives, all these things are perfectly cast iron set. So they will not be willing to move. But we understand that from the other side of the fence, the quality of research has deteriorated so badly that we need to find a way out of this quality deterioration. And one of the ways is to open your mind to the possibility of knowledge generated in other disciplines being be a synthesis of knowledge and methods. To achieve this, you have to understand, you have to make an effort to try and understand a language which you say is not your own. So you have to have motivation towards communicability. For example, I make it a point, when I was teaching, to go into the physics department to know more about chaos theory, complexity. And physics department helps a lot because they talk about the universe in general. They talk standpoint, talk about context, understanding of an idea, and they will be able to guide us in huge manner. And you have writers like Bradotti who talk about posthumanism. You have people like Haraway. To read Haraway, you need to have some idea of what is going on in the area of science. And of course, to know Karan Barad, who talks about agential realism, without knowing a bit of physics or brushing up what you have known about physics, you will not be able to understand Karan Barad. So you take Karan Barad, go into the physics department and ask them, what does she mean? And that idea will help us to understand our text in a different manner, which is very necessary right now. Because, we are all aspiring to be teachers or we're already teachers. And one question that we repeatedly face is that Google knows everything. So what are you doing? Google can teach. The difference between Google teaching you and a teacher teaching you is that Google gives you information. A teacher contextualizes the information. So in much the same way, the researcher too should contextualize the information. So in your synopsis, you will be asked, there's a column where you are asked to state the relevance of the research. And that's a very comic column actually, because always the relevance of the research is local, it's national, it's statewide, but you need to take a deep look at what you're actually saying. Another thing is that if you're aiming for a research scholarship abroad, particularly in the field of literature, what I have seen recently is that because a lot of my students have applied for scholarship and some of them have actually got it, they do not want you to go and tell them what their writers are doing. They want you to tell them what your writers are doing and to make them understand how your culture has sort of evolved and what is new, what is happening in this particular area, what are the native writers writing, what is the indigenous population doing. These things are being highlighted. So no longer is research talking about what Milton did in the Puritan age, particularly in the area of literature. So like I said, the first point is communicability. It does not necessitate the simplification of terminology, but you have to be able to explain disciplinary specific terms using accessible examples. To make you understand this, I'll just give you an example from a movie. There is a movie called The Big Short, S-H-O-R-T, B-I-G-S-H-O-R-T. So it's all about investing in the stock market. And people from different areas of life want to understand the workings of the dynamics of the stock market. And some of them, one of them is a ballerina, another is a chef, another is a teacher, and they use the technical jargon in their own language, in their own discipline, to understand the working of the stock market. So we understand that it is a process of translation also. Because one idea is being explained by a chef in a particular manner, by a doctor in another manner, and by the ballerina in a language that only ballerinas will understand. So they're trying to make it relevant for themselves. So that is what the meaning of communicability. It's not that you make it very simple, rather you try to capture it like that happens in the process of translation, or foreignizing of words and domestication of words. You try to make it your own. Try to understand what it means in your context. That is the essence of communicability. Now, to demand complete stylistic homogeneity of the contributors is a betrayal of the idea of interdisciplinarity. So the reader or the researcher has the responsibility, that is the willingness to research texts which are not from your own discipline, references and terms, and a will and a determination to be open-minded at all times. So that is where you will encounter things called a threshold concept. So a threshold concept opens a new and previously inaccessible way of thinking about something. It represents a transformed way of understanding or interpreting something without which the learner cannot progress. As a consequence of comprehending a threshold concept, there may be a transformed view of the subject matter, the subject landscape, or even the worldview. Such a transformed view may represent how people think in a particular discipline, how they perceive, apprehend, or experience. And this is being changed with the threshold concept. So, threshold concepts. These are the characteristics of threshold concepts. They're transformative, they change, they're integrated. So they bring in different ideas together, they blur boundaries, and they're conceptually difficult. Now, why are they conceptually difficult? Because they are concepts which are alien to your chosen area. But you make it your own. You sort of take it over, appropriate it, and make it your own. And that is how you get the intellectual rigor, the intellectual stamina to understand things, and the paradigm shift will naturally occur. I think a huge amount of work is being done in the world of medical humanities, in the area of psychiatry, the idea of racism, gene therapy. Now, all these things are very, very interdisciplinary in the approaches. So, yeah, let's just. Um, Well, I'll just give you a couple of areas and a couple of books where these thoughts, this interdisciplinarity, is being very, very effectively put to use and effectively being developed. The first one I would like to talk about is Neuro Feminism. So, second wave feminists began using the sex gender dichotomy in the early 60s. You have people like Simone de Beauvoir, Greer, and all that to emphasize that psychological and behavioral characteristics associated with masculinity and femininity were products of socialization, and these are gender characters. The emphasis on socialization was meant to combat earlier notions of biological determination. You understand what biological determination is, and changes designed to eliminate gender inequality would also eliminate gender differences. Then the social origins of most differences between men and women would be again questioned. So, feminist approaches to neurosciences have evaluated the debates surrounding practices of knowledge production within and research results of contemporary brain research, and they have examined the gendered impact of neuroscientific research. And you have contemporary neurocultures have highlighted the entanglements of neuroscientific research within society and the implications of neurofacts for gendered cultural symbolisms, social practices, and power relations. It also analyzes the portrayal of neuro knowledge in popular media. So, Rebecca Jordan Young, if you want to Google her, you can. She's done a lot of work in this area. Has shown that the linear model, which she calls the brain organization theory, still dominates much of the developmental neurobiology. So, given the influence of this line of explanation and the equation of sex difference with biological difference, it is clear why people are tempted to conclude the kinds of psychological and behavioral differences which are claimed by feminists to be gender differences are actually sex differences and the result of the unfolding of the inevitable biological process. Yet, a number of you have the other side as well. The feminist scientists have argued that because the body and the brain is changed by experiences, the biological cannot mean the natural or innate or the product of sex rather than gender. It is impossible, they say, to disentangle the effects of sex from those of gender difference on the brain, as the very utility of the question between sex and gender has been questioned. So it is very important that you know this, because otherwise you will still keep on talking about one is not born, but rather one becomes a woman. So Simone de Beauvoir is there. She's important. She's very contextual though. But is Simone de Beauvoir, like, we made this mistake with Shakespeare for all time? No, perhaps not. So that's the reason why, because Simone de Beauvoir did not have this particular neuro idea available for her when she made the remark about the sex gender dichotomy. So we need to take a look at the neuro feminist ideologies of this particular process before we tell our students or we quote Simone de Beauvoir in our research thesis. That is, I feel very disappointed when I still see project proposals quoting Simone de Beauvoir. Of course, Simone de Beauvoir is important, but it's like, the Beauvoir becomes a religion then for all time. Only religion exists in that framework. Everything else is changing. So yeah, from there we'll just move on to uh, this particular novel. This is a novel I often talk about, written by Olga Tokarczuk, called Flights, and it won the Booker. So it's unclassifiable. Is it fiction? It won the Booker Prize, of course, but when we read it, we don't know whether it's a work of fiction, but it's also an exercise in theory, in cultural anthropology, and it's also a memoir. So the narrator is an unnamed Polish writer and wants to travel. And the novel is an omnium gatherum, which means a big book full of many peculiar parts. And the book's two great themes, that is, twinning the fictional and the non fictional, are two things: curiosity and mobility. And like the characters, the narrator is always on the move, always noticing things and theorizing, often brilliantly. And this thing can be called a flaneural essayism. That becomes another area altogether, where you have people who walk at night into certain spots of the city and look at things and understand things, and they become part of it. So here we look at travel itself. And travel is understood as a masculine mode, because men can travel at any point of time to any place at any point of time in the day or night, but this is not accessible to women. So the idea of travel itself is a gendered concept, and Olga's book actually helps you to look at the idea of agency which is there in people. It need not be just a gender-based agency. It can also be caste-based, class-based, race-based. So these are the, and again, this particular book uses a lot of scientific terminology, uses a lot of aeronautical terminology, which we may not understand. So what do? We have to check it out. We have to Google it. We have to go to the dictionary. We have to go to the encyclopedia to understand what is this book all about, and why does Olga write like this? Because she understands that the modern world is an entangled world. There is no separation. You cannot separate the local from the global anymore. You cannot separate the virus from the human anymore. So the only way to approach literature from the present context is to make it as multiple as possible, as wide as possible. As we are running short of time, I'll just go to another book which I found very interesting. Yeah, it's written by Christy Wampole, and the title of the book is called um, Rootedness: The Ramifications of a Metaphor. So the idea of a metaphor, which is not just linguistic, it is there in science also, because when in science we often say when A is B, A is equal to B, though A and B are different. So that is the basic idea of a metaphor also. So Christy Wampole actually, he looks at the entire world through the idea, the metaphor of a root വേരുകൾ അതൊരു മെറ്റഫോറായിട്ട് ഉപയോഗിച്ചിട്ടാണ് he is trying to picture the entire world, the cultural symbolisms that we have, the literature which has evolved from it, and of course brings in the concept of the rhizome, which was put forward by Deleuze and Guattari. So let me just very briefly take you through this idea of Christy Wampole. So, how does the root differ from other metaphors for origin? And this becomes quite important in the present talk on interdisciplinarity, because it questions the idea of rootedness, right? And that is why I brought in the idea of the rhizo. So, rootedness is imperial, rootedness is hegemonic, rootedness, it doesn't allow the nomad to move. Rootedness is about belonging to a particular place, whereas now we are talking about disentanglement, or entangling ourselves in multiplicities. So the idea of the root, why does it get so much, why is it so primate? What does the constant use of this metaphor say about the human's relationship to the botanical world? The relationship between Judaism and the trope of rootlessness is one of the most well-researched aspects of the root metaphor. And the conception of spiritual and intellectual transcendence in European thought, again, are predicated on rootedness. Then you have the identity politics stemming from the fallout of colonialism, often borrowing metaphors of uprooting, transplantation, vegetal invasion. And the paganistic idea of human embeddedness in nature gets refashioned time and again, lyricized throughout literature, and legitimated through politics, philosophy, and science. There's something clearly so compelling in the root as a metaphor that we don't think of the metaphor of the root, we rather accept it as such. So when you think of the overlap of nationalism and ecology, the political uses of genealogy and etymology, the literalization of metaphors, and the overwhelming sense of alienation brought by globalization and technological modernity. So interest in one's roots increases in proportion to the perceived level of danger that threatens these roots. People think of themselves as most rooted when something, the foreigner, new values, new technologies, and forced expulsion jeopardizes this perceived embeddedness in a culture or a place. So this is exactly what we are doing now. We are trying to uproot ourselves from the idea of one discipline and to understand that there are multiple exit points and multiple entry points. So the desire for rootedness is a conservative desire for comfort. Comfort here means the existential consolation of the strength-giving sameness. You're content with routine, you're contented with status quo, you want stereotypes, and that is why the human mind is so attracted to the metaphor of the root. And root seeking is often symptomatic of ecological alienation. It is the evidence of a species wide guilt about our self extraction from the earth as a system. And root logic is selective also. So, atavism, or thinking about your roots, is appealing only when the ancestor can be positively mythologized. The shameful ancestor is never spoken about. And that is where you have the thousand splendid plateaus, and going into full manifesto mode at the end of the introduction. Deleuze and Guattari write, make rhizomes, not roots. Never plant, don't sow. Grow shoots, don't be one or multiple, be multiplicities. Run lines, never plot a point. Alternately, a manifesto, a diary of doubt, a theory laden academic document, a fiction, a history book, an essay, and many other genres, a text ultimately refuses to decide what it wants to be. So, like I said, this is a perfect example, like Olga's Flights and Deleuze's A Thousand Splendid Plateaus. I refuse to be what you think I should be. The novel says, oh, this is not what I am. You had exactly what Eliot was doing quite some time ago. You want a poem? Well, Wasteland is a poem. The threshold concept disturbing you. And again, Eliot is a very fine example of interdisciplinarity. So, Walpole's multiplication, mashing up of metaphors anticipates the maximalist, imagistic combinatorics of Deleuze and Guattari, who made their claims in Anti-Oedipus not through reason, but through the accumulation of synonymous amalgamations. So yeah, and now I'll just move on to this idea called book history. And when you think about book history, it is not just tracing the ancestry of a book. It is also looking at a particular tradition. And one of the recent books which caught my attention was The Ascent to Glory, how 100 Years of Solitude was written and became a global classic. So if you just go to this book written by, let me see what's the name, Acuna, Alvaro Santana Acuna, Acuna's 100 Years of Glory. Now, how this book ascended. So the idea is that when in the 60s, before the 60s, the idea of Latin American fiction was not there. So you had these nationalistic fiction coming from Peru, coming from Brazil. So these different nations were producing literature. It's only in the 60s when a certain magazine spoke about the idea of Latin American culture and Latin American literature. And thankfully, Marquez was able to step into this niche. And suddenly, what was very, very local became universal. And again, through a translation of Marquez. And Marquez becomes a global, gained global status. And the 100 Years of Solitude becomes a cult classic. The question Acuna raises is that there are many other writers writing from the same place. Why didn't they become classics? It's not just aesthetic. The question is not one of aesthetic value alone, but there are other players there. Like I said, the publisher, the translator, the entire industry, the commercialization of publication. All these players are important players in the game of literature. And he just tells you, please read that book. It will help you to understand how one book gains cult status above the rest. And we've done enough research about Shakespeare in that manner. Now you know why Marquez has done that. I'm sure that somebody in Kerala will also make an effort to understand why empty becomes the sort of canon, why Tagari becomes a canon, and why certain other writers are completely disregarded. I often tell my students the process of decolonization of thought has still occurred within the Department of English Literature, because you and I, we're very familiar with the ghosts of Shakespeare. Hamlet's ghosts and Macbeth's witches, which have really nothing to do with us. They're very royalist in their outlook towards life. We need to know more about Sri Ayyappan's ghosts, Preda Bhashanam, where he makes the specters speak against a system, the system which is erected by the so-called upper caste hegemony. But These goals are not familiar to us, again, because we have not succeeded in breaking away from the idea of the literature, English literature, as a discipline which ought to focus on British literature. So, unless and until we train ourselves to become intellectual nomads, this change is not going to happen. So, before I wind up, I would just like to talk about another book, which is again very interesting. The book is known called Contagion, and I chose this book to end this conversation because this is very relevant to us. I don't know whether we are ever going to be rid of this particular contagion. The uncontrollability and unknowability of contagion. It surprises appearance in other bodies, in other creatures, and this invites systems of control and knowledge. Now, this is something that we have already been exposed to when Agamben wrote saying that there is no coronavirus, and Zizek wrote out a book on the pandemic. And you have to hear what the book Contagion is doing, is talking about the idea, the vocabulary that is used, which is borrowed from many other areas. Now let's look at this. Various lines of hygiene are drawn to contain circulating dangers represented as contagion and to render particular subjects or spaces safe or immune. They also elaborate on the ways in which these cultural, political efforts so often fail. This fantasy of controlling contagion, this dream of hygienic containment, has a marked modern history of imperialism and culture. So, um, Bashford and Hooker tell us that the chronological and epistemological schema of postmodernity and modernity can be mapped onto colonialism and post-colonialism. The nexus of modernity, biomedicine, and colonialism. To study infectious diseases historically is also to question and make visible the process and concept of colonization. For like contagion, colonization is about contact, self multiplication, and not infrequently destruction. So, what this amazing book does is to talk about the idea of the body and the health of the body and the virus within the body, and how this can be mapped on to the idea of colonialism as well, because it's a colony of bacteria, right, that we talk about. So the colony of bacteria on the Petri dish, the appearance of leper colonies in the 19th and 20th century, and the defense of the immune self and the immune community or nation from external invasion. The notion of diplomatic immunity, on the other hand, the resistance of colonized people and the resistance of the individual embodied subject to the disease which invades us, disease which attacks us, and the global distribution of hegemonic practices of Western biomedicine. And the crossover of concepts situates the very notion of contagion inside a history of imperialism and colonial discourse, as well as a history of biomedicine. So I'm just quoting extensively from this book. And there's a brilliant study, Anderson's study of American colonization in early 20th century Philippines called excremental colonialism, revealing the imperative of health to be an effective way of constructing and maintaining boundaries between the colonizers and the colonized, a way of creating the otherness of the colonized territory and people. He details a process by which contagion and its management created American colonial identity and through the regulation of conduct, producing and sustaining wider social relations. Yeah. So, like I said, we have the idea of the colony, and now we also have the idea of the post-human, where the multiplicities are coming together. All right. So, to understand post-humanism, to go into the idea of transhumanism, we need to have a holistic approach towards life and literature. So that's all I have to say. Thank you. Hello.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Any
So,
questions?
if audience, if you have any questions, you can ask directly now. Biju sir, are you there online?
log out then? I think there's
Hello,
some
ma'am.
confusion with the net.
No,
Hello?
ma'am, it's audible.
Yeah.
It's audible, actually. Yeah. I think the audience, they don't have any questions regarding it.
Yeah.
One
So
second, ma'am.
we'll just call it a day.
So, okay, ma'am, as I think there is no more queries, we'll wind up the session. But anyway, the session you have handled regarding, as it was, even though based on literature base, it was a very well informative talk. And thank you. So, now I invite Mr. P. Manu, the research scholar from the Department of English, for delivering the vote of thanks. Manu, please.
Thank you. The Honorable and invited lecturer Dr. Priya Nair, respected Chair Dr. C.S. Biju, other faculty members, fellow scholars, and my dear friends. Good afternoon, all. Feeling gratitude and not expressing it is like wrapping a present and not giving it, said William Arthur Ward. So it is my privilege to have been asked to propose a word of thanks on this occasion. We have been fortunate to have a renowned identity from the world of English literature studies and an English scholar, writer, and assistant professor at St. Theresa's College, Ernakulam, Dr. Priya K. Nair. I, on behalf of the entire Department of English at St. Thomas College, Thrissur, would like to thank Priya ma'am for her interesting session. I believe that this session would imbibe consciousness and enable aspiring researchers to, to explore newer frontiers of studies and knowledge. Thank you, ma'am. Next, I want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to the session chair, Dr. C.S. Biju, who is a vibrant faculty of the Department of English, St. Thomas College, Thrissur, who served as the backbone of this session. This session became more organized and completed within the specified time limit because of your timely interventions and perfect coordination, sir. I extend my sincere thanks to the technical team comprising of our staff, scholars, and students who burned the midnight oil to make this session a success. I cannot live without marking our gratefulness to all the paper presenters and the participants who cooperated with us in this event in every sense. I would also take this opportunity to thank each one of our participants who made this session worthwhile. Thank you once again to everyone and have a nice day.
Thank you for delivering the vote of thanks. So once again, thank you, Priya ma'am, for spending your valuable time with us. So thank you so much. So now we are coming to the end of technical session 2, and now we will have a third technical session which will start by 2:45 p.m., which will be handled by Dr. P. Bhaskaran Nair, former professor from Pondicherry Central University. So by 2:45 we'll be back for the third session on topic academic writing. Till then, see you.